Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another edition of Rock's Garage. I'm your host, Dan, and on today's episode, we're going to be installing a new steering rack on our club car Precedent, part number STR-028. Now, before we get started, let's take a look at what comes in the box and the tools that we're going to need to perform installation. Now, when you open up your box, you're going to find your steering rack itself. You'll notice that it does not come with the tie rod ends. Now, we're going to be reusing the tie rod ends in our cart. Those look pretty good to me, but if you needed to replace those would be part number STR-042 and 043, respectively. Now, before we install this on the cart, let's take a look at the tools that we're going to need to perform our installation. So in order to remove our old steering rack and install our new one, the tools that we're going to need are a 13mm deep well socket with an extension, a socket wrench. We also need a 10mm, a 12mm, and a 13mm wrench. After that, we have a 17mm and a 3/4 inch wrench. And now that we've taken a look at all the tools, let's go ahead and jump into the installation. Now, before we get started with any of the installation, we got to make sure that we turn our cart off, set our parking brake, and if we have an electric cart, we're going to flip our tow run switch to the tow position. Now, the first step in our installation process is to remove the front bumper. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and remove the tie rod ends from the spindles. Now that we have our tie rod ends disconnected from our spindles, our next step is to remove the 3 bolts that hold the steering rack to the cart. Now, you'll notice that when we pull our steering rack off, there's going to be some spacers behind it. That's just because we have the lift kit on here. If you're doing this on a stock cart, you're not going to have those. I just wanted to point that out so you guys don't get worried about you not having parts. Now, in order for us to completely remove the steering rack, we have to make sure that we loosen this bolt right here on our steering column, and that will allow the whole steering rack to fall out. Now that our steering rack is removed, our next step is to remove our tie rod ends. Now, we're only removing our tie rod ends because we are reinstalling these on the new steering rack. If you bought new tie rod ends, obviously you don't have to remove the old ones from your old steering rack, but this would be the time where you would install the tie rod ends onto the new steering rack. So our first step is we have to back off this jam nut. Then once we've done that, we can just thread off the tie rod end. Now we're going to repeat the same process on the other side. And now with our new steering rack, we're going to go ahead and just install our tie rod ends back on the end. So now that our tie rod ends are installed, we can go ahead and install our new steering rack on the cart. Before we do that, we want to make sure that our steering wheel is straight before we attach our steering column to the rack. Now when we're installing the new steering rack, we're going to attach our steering column to the steering rack, but we're not going to put that bolt in yet, so it'll give us some movement to allow us to put the bolts back into the body. And again, we have a lift kit installed in this cart, so we had to use some steering rack spacers in order to get everything to line up. If you're doing this on a stock cart, you won't have to do that. So now that our steering rack is attached to our spindles, we want to make sure that our steering rack is centered. So on the input shaft for the Club Car Precedent steering rack, there is a little notch that helps you line it up on the steering column, but just to double check that, you want to make sure that you turn your steering wheel all the way to the driver's side, and then we're going to count the rotations that it takes to get to full lock on the passenger side. We're going to divide that by 2, and then that will be the center point for our steering rack. We want to make sure that we do this so that when we go to perform our alignment, everything is centered and we don't have a steering wheel that's off center. However, if we get back after we've done our alignment and our steering wheel is still not centered, we can go ahead and take that steering wheel off and just adjust that on the steering column. Go all the way to the driver's side. We're going to count the rotations it takes to get to the passenger side. So that's 1, 2, 3, about 3 1/4. So we're going to go 1 and about 3/4. That's going to be centered. So we can go ahead and adjust our steering rack and steering wheel accordingly. Now that our steering rack is attached to our cart, our next step is to attach our tie rod ends to our spindles. Now that our tie rod ends are attached to our spindles, our next step is to perform our alignment. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take a tape measure and we're going to measure center to center on the front and the rear of our tires. and we're going to try to achieve a 1/8 of an inch toe in, which means the front of our tires are 1/8 of an inch closer than the rear of our tires. We're going to make any adjustments by rotating the steering arms, and then once that's done, we can go ahead and lock down those jam nuts. Once your alignment is done, you can go ahead and reinstall your front bumper. And when that's done, that'll complete the installation for part number STR-028 on our Club Car Precedent. Now, if you need an in-depth guide on how to perform an alignment, you can go ahead and watch our How to Perform an Alignment on a Golf Cart video. Thanks for watching this episode of Rock's Garage, and I'll see you next time.